Welcome to Barbara Undershaft's Profession. I'm Jean Reynolds. How will future audiences relate to Bernard Shaw? It's a question that concerns us today, and one that also intrigued Shaw. In 1895, he suggested a way to classify which plays will endure and which will not. One category is utilitarian plays that have done work in the world. The other is timeless plays that are always as fresh as paint. Which category is right for Major Barbara? Because this is such a rich play, the question is a complicated one. I'd like to propose that we embark on a few minutes of time travel to look for an answer. Our first stop is 1961, when Robert Heinlein published his futuristic novel Stranger in a Strange Land and introduced the wonderful word grok. To grok is to unite mentally and emotionally with another person, so closely that you're both thinking and feeling as one. Those of you who are Trekkies will remember Mr. Spock's Vulcan mind meld, the same idea. Grokking came to mind recently when I started thinking about my education as an English major in college. The goal was to learn how to think and feel like a famous writer from the past, to grok. So, in the case of Shaw, I would try to learn his positions about issues like poverty, wealth, and warfare, and I would study his life and times to learn how he arrived at those positions. This kind of study is immensely helpful in learning about literature, but there's also a potential danger. We can never completely shed our own experiences and our own era to learn what it's like to be someone from the past. For example, I see Barbara Undershaft as a young woman who's very constrained by her social position and her era. But I've talked to younger drama students who see her as free to do just about anything she wants to do. Of course, they might be right. But in my lifetime, I've seen the lifting of many restrictions on women, and that makes me think that Barbara may have faced some serious challenges. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. When I was first married, I applied for a store credit card. I was working full-time and my husband was working part-time. They turned me down, and they said if my husband applied for the card, they'd give it to him and put my name on it. Second example, I can remember going to a woman doctor for a checkup and having the bill sent to my husband. Third example, this is a humdinger. I was in graduate school in New York City in the late 1960s. A woman was dismissed from the program. One of my professors told me that one of the reasons was that the woman was married and therefore considered frivolous. We'll return to opportunities for women soon. Now we're going to travel to the West End of London in 1941 at the height of the Blitz. We're going to drop in on Act 3 of a performance of Major Barbara. Undershaft is just declaiming the faith of an armorer, to sell arms to anyone willing to pay for them, regardless of what cause they're fighting for, and without considering any crimes they might be committing. Just then a siren sounds. Enemy bombers overhead. Everyone rushes out of the theater and into an underground shelter. They spend the night listening to the bombs falling and wondering whether they'll ever see their loved ones again, and whether their homes will be standing the next morning. Okay, time travelers, now it's 1956, and we're visiting a high school English class on Long Island. They're watching the Wendy Hiller-Rex Harrison film of Major Barbara. Again, it's Act 3. Andrew has just received some good news. His latest weapon is performing better than expected. 300 soldiers just died in a Manchurian fort. Cousins, that's Barbara's fiancé, hesitantly asks whether Andrew means 300 dummies. No, says Andrew cheerfully. Those were real soldiers. Just then a loud bell starts clanging. The vice principal comes up on the PA system and says, "Air raid drill. Drop and cover." Students crouch under their desks to protect themselves from an atomic bomb. It's a drill I did again and again when I was in school. Our last stop is beautiful Niagara-on-the-Lake in 2013. We're again dropping in on Act 3 of Major Barbara. A CEO is in the audience, taking a well-deserved break from the challenges of running a successful business. Even though she's on vacation, she has her phone in her pocket, set to vibrate, so that she can stay in touch with the company. She's watching the debate between Cousins and Undershaft about poverty, wealth, and warfare. They're also arguing about Cousins's working conditions if he takes a job in the factory. Our CEO notices a few things. Cousins has no business experience. He's a Greek scholar. Barbara, on the other hand, has run a successful shelter and dealt skillfully with a varied clientele there. She's shown herself to be an effective problem solver. But there's a job for Cousins and none for her. Our CEO also notices that all the factory workers are male. And she notices that during the debate between Cousins and Undershaft, Barbara stands on the side of the stage in silence. Now let's return to 2017. Our travels through time seem to suggest that Major Barbara is a utilitarian play, rather than one that's fresh as paint. Dynamite weapons are very different from nuclear warheads. Women's lives were very different in 1905, when Major Barbara was first performed. Of course we can and should take the Shavian debate about poverty, wealth, and warfare into the 21st century. But we need to be careful not to lose touch with Shaw's original play. That's always a risk. On the other hand, maybe we don't need to worry about what's going to happen to Major Barbara. Playgoers in the 21st century don't seem to care that so much time has passed. They like the play just the way it is. Here's just a partial list of productions around the world in the past 10 years. So perhaps we need to put Major Barbara into the fresh as paint category after all. And that takes us to a new question. Why do theatergoers keep buying tickets? My suggested answer is that Major Barbara is about something more than poverty, wealth, and warfare. It's a play about the theater. Barbara is not just a Salvation Army worker. She's an actor, as well as a theater producer, director, and playwright. And here's what I find even more interesting. That's also true of the other characters in the play. They're always acting, talking about role-playing, and staging plays for one another's benefit, often without their awareness. So even for Shaw, Major Barbara is unusually preoccupied with meatheatre, defined as the theater examining itself. Hardly a minute goes by that doesn't involve a miniature play. We'll take a look at some of these plays in just a few minutes. But right now I want to focus on Barbara Undershaft. I'm suggesting that embedded within Major Barbara is another play that I'm calling Barbara Undershaft's Profession. The title of our alternative play obviously harks back to Mrs. Warren's profession. I know that seems surprising. Kitty's business is sex, and Barbara's is saving souls. But I think they have something important in common. Both of them took a long, hard look at the future and were frightened by what they saw. Kitty saw herself working in the white lead factory, destined for poverty, illness, and an early death. Barbara saw herself turning into her mother, the formidable but unfulfilled Lady Britomart. Shaw describes Lady Britomart as a very typical managing matron of the upper class who conceives the universe exactly as if it were a large house in Wilton Crescent. Barbara, destined for a brilliant marriage, knows the same fate awaits her. Of course, we know what happens. On a lark, Barbara attends a Salvation Army meeting. She hears a powerful spiritual message that changes her life. But perhaps it wasn't just the religious message that made such an impression. After all, Barbara was raised in a devoutly Christian home. We know that her mother conducts a prayer service every night. So what made that street meeting such a powerful experience for Barbara? For the first time, she saw women preaching and holding leadership positions, something the established Church of England didn't do for many years after. Right from its beginnings in 1865, long before women even had the right to vote, the Salvation Army gave women equal status with men. So the Salvation Army gave Barbara a platform, both literally and symbolically, where she could explore her potential through what Shaw called metaphysical role-playing. That alone might make Major Barbara an interesting play for modern audiences. But Shaw gives us much more, for everyone in Shaw's play is preoccupied with theater. In Act 1, for example, Lady Britomart has invited her estranged husband, Andrew Undershaft, to meet his grown children for the first time in many years. At least that's what she says. The truth is that Lady Britomart is actually staging a little play we might call The Tiger Fights for Her Children. She's hoping Andrew will realize that his daughters will be marrying men who can't support them properly, and he'll decide to settle money on both couples. So Barbara, Sarah, Adolphus, and Charles are unwitting actors in a play staged by Lady Britomart, and Andrew is the unknowing audience. We see more plays in Act 2. The Salvation Army clients are producing their own play. We might call it Saints and Sinners, where they pretend to be both more wicked and more virtuous than they really are for the benefit of the shelter workers. Now it's Barbara who's the audience. She's also the audience for Prince of Darkness, a play staged by Andrew to disillusion Barbara about the Salvation Army. The actors in that production are Mrs. Baines and Andrew himself. And there's still another play, a one-man show we might call The Secret Skeptic. It stars Adolphus Cousins, who pretends to be a devout convert in order to win Barbara's hand in marriage. There are also two miniature comedies of manners, one starring Morrison the butler, and the other featuring Charles Lomax and a box of matches. I wish I had time to talk about these. And I could go on and on. But now I'd like to return to Barbara's role-playing. Because time is limited, I'd like to look at the ending of the play, which has always vexed audiences and critics. Adolphus, or Dolly, has just accepted a job in Andrew's factory. As the play comes to an end, Barbara holds on to her mother's skirt and drags her away, saying, "I want a house in the village to live in with Dolly. Come and tell me which one to take." We're cringing. What happened to the dynamic Major Barbara, who effortlessly managed a Salvation Army shelter and its ragtag clientele? But I'd like to suggest that it looks different if we view the ending of the play through the lens of role-playing. The little girl we see hanging on to her mother's skirt as the curtain comes down isn't really new to us. There's evidence throughout the play that Barbara is still a somewhat naive young woman, in spite of her success with the shelter. The Army didn't change who Barbara was, it changed what she did. And we have Barbara's own testimony for that. Before I joined the Salvation Army, I was in my own power, and the consequence was that I never knew what to do with myself. When I joined it, I had not time enough for all the things I had to do. But now Barbara has lost her platform. What will happen to her? It seems likely that her worst fears are about to be realized. She's going to turn into her mother, channeling her considerable energies into her hapless future children. But perhaps there's a ray of hope. A speech near the end of the play suggests that Barbara has begun a process of change that might take her life into a new direction. But first we need to spend a few moments talking about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Most Christians believe that there are three persons in one God: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Believers can relate to these persons in different ways. So we're again talking about a kind of role-playing. If I think of God primarily as a father, as Barbara does, then I will take on the role of an obedient and trusting child. If I relate primarily to the Son, I will take on the role of a repentant sinner, sad about my sins and grateful for Jesus' sacrificial death. Or, especially if I'm a woman, I might think of myself as the bride of Christ. If I focus primarily on the Holy Spirit, my religious practices will probably tend towards mysticism. I said earlier that Barbara relates to God primarily as a loving father. A Jungian psychologist might say that the father archetype constellates the child archetype. Here's something that astonished me recently when I started looking at the play more closely. Jesus is never mentioned, not once, unless you count the singing of Onward Christian Soldiers off stage. Throughout the play, Barbara sees herself as God's obedient and trusting child. But just before the final curtain, Barbara overturns traditional Christian theology with this astonishing speech. I'm changing him to God. Let God be in my debt, not I in his, and let me forgive God as becomes a woman of my rank. That's not a child speaking. Less than 24 hours after her crisis with faith, Barbara has found a new way to relate to God. Her new pride gives a whole new meaning to Shaw's idea of metaphysical role-playing. So, what will happen next? Will Barbara find a new profession? There's no way to tell. Or, to put it differently, it's up to each of us to write our own sequel to Shaw's play. And perhaps that Shavian gift of freedom is the greatest argument that Major Barbara is, after all these years, still as fresh as paint.